Hey everyone, welcome back to a brand new video, another recap of my tournament in Portugal. I am now in Rome in front of one of the 7 wonders of the world. I'm in front of the Colosseum in Rome. And that's where we're gonna be making our recap of today. I'm so excited. Welcome to round 6. So I was playing against a Spaniard. I'm not too good against Spanish. I've played 2 Spanish in my career so far, and I've lost to both. So going into this game, even though he was 1700, I was a bit nervous. Understand me, please.
And as always, we have some lessons learned at the end of the video to provide some value for you. This time we have 8 lessons learned.
And so my opponent starts off the game with d4 as I have the black pieces. Now, I feared heavy preparation against me, so I just erase it all with knight f6 and play absolutely nothing that I've done in the past. So now my opponent goes with bishop f4, which indicates what? That they're gonna play a London system. Too bad we're not in London. So now I go c5, just completely eradicating any London system opportunities for my opponents, which forces a d5. Not forces, but it forces a response that is not too comfortable with the London systems in general. So d5 here, and then we hop in to somewhat of a Benoni. So I go d6, knight c3, g6, and then the development is very smooth. My opponent goes with bishop c4, and here we see a very textbook Benoni structure, although I have a pawn on e7. So usually this pawn is traded off for this one, and this d6 pawn is very weak. But in this position, my pawn structure is actually pretty solid, and I'm quite happy here. Though after bishop c4, I had seen a small tactic already in this game. I saw b5. And here, if you take, I just take this e4 pawn and I have a centralized knight, I'm killing it right now. So bishop takes b5 is only the best move looking, but I have still knight takes e4, which has the idea to deflect the knight off the defense of this bishop. And after knight takes e4 here, queen a5 check, forking this king and this bishop. And after knight c3, which is forced, defending the bishop, I would have to trade off my bishop here and then win here. I have to trade off my super valuable open diagonal fianchetto bishop, which I hate, and it's textbook to hate to trade that one off. So I don't do it, even though the engine evaluates that it's minus 0.5 because it's a forcing line, and so it destroys the pawn structure, but I couldn't bear with it. I'm just giving up my best bishop. Can't do that. So instead, I play queen a5, which threatens e5, and after castles here, now I go with b5. After knight takes, which is the best move for white, I thought just knight takes and it's fine, but here, white have queen e1, which is crazy. And after queen takes, rook takes, I somehow have to defend this and the knight hopping on to c7 to win my rook. So I would have to play a6, attacking this knight, knight c7, rook a7, and then after takes, white just has a really nice positional advantage, and I didn't see this line. I stopped calculating, to be honest, after knight takes e4, which is a big mistake in my calculation. And this time around, if you take with the bishop, I just go knight h5, attacking this bishop, and once you defend it or move, then I have bishop takes c3, and now I really win a piece. Now it's a lucrative, real-life tactic that wins me material. So, knight takes b5 was played, and now I go for knight takes e4, and then my opponent goes for queen d3, which is quite different than queen e1, because it doesn't attack my queen, which defends c7. So now I have time to play a6 now, as opposed to before when the queens are traded off. And if you take my knight, I take here, I attack your bishop, and it's such a beautiful position for the black pieces. I'm in love. So after a6, knight d4 is played. I calculated everything here. Knight c3 loses a pawn to knight takes c3. Knight a3 loses to bishop takes b2. Ouchie, ouchie here. Even knight takes d6 loses to defending my knight and taking on d7. Knight c7 loses to queen takes, I'm up a pawn here. But the only move I didn't look at was played, and that's knight d4. And after going back, which is, in my opinion, the best move, because it forces a move out of this knight, knight b3, and now I go for queen a4. My queen, once again, similar to that game against the Indian IM that was 2400, I put my queen in the lion's den, really where it could be super trapped easily, but I calculated this with such preciseness that the queen can actually not be touched. So the point of this is to laser through on the rank side of the fourth rank. First, this bishop can't move, and if it does, this bishop is vulnerable. So it's a nice horizontal tactic. If this queen moves away, I would have things like knight takes d5, and then on takes, you know, I can take here. So it's just like holding the position and stopping possibilities of my opponents. So bishop c1 is played, and now I play bishop f5. And this is a huge lesson in development. The best way to develop, you guys, is to develop with tempo on better pieces than yours, force pieces to move on your time, and now it's your move again, and you develop again on very nice squares for your pieces. Knight d2 is played. By the way, bishop c1, let's just comment on that. Terrible move. Counter development, really, really bad. I'll talk about this in the lessons learned, but of course, you know, I cover pretty much everything there. Here, I didn't love taking the pawn. I wasn't a big fan. Oh, there's a4 apparently, and my queen's trapped, and bishop b3 is coming. Wow, and my queen can't go back. Okay, so in the game, I was like, I don't love that pawn, and I didn't like to take with the bishop either. I just didn't love it. So I go with knight b6. I attack this bishop, bishop b3, and then queen d7. c4 is played, and suddenly we really hate their bishop pair. Especially this bishop is just blocking everything. Like, the bishop on b3 is blocking this possibility in the future, which is blocking the pawn chain. So here I go for a5, and the idea is I'm threatening a4. But if you go a4 yourself, I would have somewhat of a knight a8, knight c7, knight a6, and then knight b4. And this knight is absolutely goated. It's called an outpost knight in chess. And let me tell you, it's worth the 5 moves. But he doesn't. He goes with a3. And suddenly I kind of don't want to play a4, even though it's the best move in this position. But I just don't know why I don't have possibilities of taking my knight to b4 in the future. Didn't love it. But the engine loves this because after bishop a2, I would have bishop c2 refugee things if my bishop is ever attacked from a knight h4. Quite interesting. So I go with the traditional plan. Like, I want to go e6. I want to open it up. I want to call the bluff on this pawn structure. After knight h4, I go e6 here. The best move is bishop g4, f3, and then bishop h5. And basically saying to the white pieces, g4 is bad. Trapping my bishop because I have enough compensation on g4, knight takes, pawn takes, bishop takes g4, which is quite odd to me. I don't think I would have ever gone for this because it's super, super sharp. Super sharp. Like, this is like more than Tau. Like Tau, well, no, it's the same as Tau. Okay, so I go with e6 here. And the idea is that I'm threatening to take with a discovered attack. So you kind of have to rush taking my bishop. And now my pawn structure is really nice. I'm covering this e4 square. It's a super nice center square that ultimately would help me infiltrate the position in the future. So queen d3 is played. And now I try to double rooks, bishop d1, odd move as well, but it's understandable. You know, white is kind of going for this plan, which they always had, and they're finally going for it. So I go rook fe8, and then rook b1 here was played. And now knight e4, just doubling rooks, just accentuating my advantage, right? I have the open file. These rooks are disconnected here, so I'm hammering my rooks on this only open file of the game, which makes it such a valuable file to conquer, and I activate my bishop in doing so. So you see all my pieces are coming together. The only guy I thought was left out is my knight on d6. I don't know where he goes, to be honest. I thought maybe a recycling plan with trying to regenerate that with renewable energy, but I thought not really. So knight f3 is played, and here I kind of lack a plan. I play queen c7. If my opponent ever goes like this, then I'd be able to take, and then I would take on c4, right? But the queen c7 move doesn't really do anything, so I don't know why I played that. Bishop e3 was played, and then I go rook b8, again to play against these things, and maybe to double rooks on the b file. Who knows, you know? This is a weak pawn, end of the day, and I could switch up my plans easily as I have a bishop and a rook staring at this b2 pawn. So queen c2 to defend, and then I go h6 to maybe play g5 in the future. I don't know. I didn't have a real plan, but I thought that in the endgame this would be really important. If ever there was a rook that was checking my king, and I wouldn't have to submit to a bishop f8, you know, with a pin to myself. So I go h6 and immediately my opponent plays h4. I mean, not even a second taken, 20 seconds. Writing down the move, h4, crazy. I was like meh in the game. I was like, it looks pretty dubious. So now I go queen c8, and all along here, right after h4, it looks like I have these really nice knight g3 things. And that's the nature of identifying a dubious move from your opponent. If it looks dubious, maybe you have something, right? But knight g3 is like mediocre. After takes, of course the black pieces would be completely winning because this pawn structure is terrible. I have the e-file, I've infiltrated, it's over. But I just saw rook e1 and I hated it. I hated knight g3. What does my knight do here anymore? Just no way to continue and move forward. And it's true, like I had nothing. So instead I went for queen c8 here to maybe go queen a6 and then attack this c4 pawn. But then, in this position, my opponent played bishop e2, which was kind of looking funky to me. I look at knight g3 again, and in this position, it actually works. Because now you still can't take my knights because I take the bishop, and your pawn structure is completely ruined on g2, g3, h4, terrible. And I have the open e-file. And if you go rook e1, now I can take this bishop, which I previously thought was a terrible bishop to take because it's inside its pawn structure, it's not active, it's disgusting, right? Before I played knight g3, I said to myself, wait, that bishop is not terrible to take, it's actually the core defender of the entire white piece's structure on c4. And if I take this bishop, I remove the defender off c4, and now white has further weaknesses. If you take back with the queen, I have f4 here, and this bishop is pinned, we win a piece. So rook takes, can't play f4 because you take. Actually, f4 actually was winning. I saw this after, and on the computer obviously, but I didn't see this in the game. I would just like discarded f4 because of bishop takes, right? But here, black has rook takes e2, queen takes, the queen is off of the f5 square now, and now we have queen f5, which is absolutely a ridiculous tactic to find in game. I did not find it, sadly enough. Instead, I played queen a6 here, you know, putting my pieces towards a weakness, ultimately. On rook c1, I can do knight takes d5 here. And if you take, I have f4 and this bishop is pinned. You cannot take because of my newly placed queen on a6 supporting that e2 square. So b3, I thought, he's gonna play b3, he has to, he defends. And now we do a very nice move, a4, to break the opponent's pawn structure. You see, one of the key positional theories in chess is that you want to break your opponent's pawn structure with something like a4. Here, I'm threatening to take the pawn, so you can't really do nothing. And if you take my pawn on a4, now this is weak. Well, first of all, I have to take my rook out of this pin, right, by moving it. And also doubling on this file, right, which is really, really nice because now I'm genuinely threatening f4 and this c4 pawn, which is super tactical, super sharp. This rook is not defended enough. So after the rook defends the rook, now I have a choice. Would you take on a4 or would you take on c4? a4 and a3 will always be weak pawns. They're weak, they're double isolated, and they're on an open file, easy to attack. They can only be super strong if they get really well defended and transposed to an endgame in which they're outside passed pawns. The c4 pawn, on the other hand, is a super weak pawn, and once I take it, I reap the reward of having a passed pawn on c5. So I decide to go for the c4 pawn. What do I take the c4 pawn with? What would you do? The knight or the queen? How are you taking this? For the longest time, I want to take with the knight because I don't want to trade queens. When we trade queens, we go to an endgame, and these pawns have a higher possibility of becoming strong outside passed pawns in the endgame. So I look at this for the longest time. I'm threatening to take another pawn with knight takes e3. Oh, it's not another pawn, but it would weaken the f pawn that would become an e3 pawn, right? I calculated that white has a really nice bishop takes c5, which is really interesting. Obviously, you're seeing the eval bar, it's not fair. So is life. But here, I thought on rook takes, and I have absolutely nothing. Because the second, I can't take back the bishop, because I lose my rook. And if I take back this rook, queen takes, and now this is pinned. And once I take back this bishop, knight d2. And I cannot, for the life of me, save my knight on c5. So back to this position, I was thinking, okay, is there another way for black to get out of here? What about takes? So on takes, I just lose a rook to rook takes, and I really have nothing. So bishop takes c5 is a desperado pretty much. I thought, what if I counter raise my opponent? I see your bluff, I raise you knight takes a3. So here I thought for a very long time on if you take here, I win a rook, because the knight takes a3 is a discovered attack on the rook here. So I'm threatening to win a rook. So you're pretty much forced to take on e7, despite your queen being attacked on c2. After knight takes c2, I calculated 2 rooks for a queen and pawn for the black pieces. Queen and 2 pawns. Check here on the king, king h7, and now the rook and bishop is still attacked. If I win one of these pieces, I win the entire game. And sure enough, black can defend this with just like rook c1. And here I calculated that it's just not good for the black pieces. Like, I cannot save my knight and win this bishop, and therefore this is at least not winning for black. Therefore, I wouldn't go into this line, because I believe in this position over here, black is winning. So I need to find a black is winning line. Sure enough, knight takes is winning, and after takes here, there's a crazy tactic for black. Rook takes, and here not taking the bishop, not moving the rook alongside here, but rook e4, threatening this bishop. And basically that's it. If the bishop moves, I can play knight takes a3 with the discovered attack on this rook, winning a full piece, a full rook. And if bishop comes to defend here, I have knight takes a3 still, attacking the queen, attacking the rook. Very, very nice. And if you take my rook, I have f takes e4. My pawn now double attacks these 2 minor pieces. So I missed this, and after a long thought of knight takes c4, I just go with queen takes c4 immediately. Swapping queens into an endgame. Okay, he plays a5, which is not that good. I think takes is better, because if takes, and now white has a turn, right? And what happened in the game is a5 attacking my knight. I can now trade queens, and now I have a turn to take on d5. I think that's a misevaluation by white, because here I take off 2 pawns. I don't have 1 protected passed pawn, but I have 2 passed pawns in this position that are connected. And I just have to look out for these pawns. They're really strong, and especially after bishop e2, consolidating the pawn on a5, I have to look out so those pawns don't get dangerous against me. So I trade rooks, and then we hop into a real endgame. Knight c7 is played, taking up that a6 square. So now bishop d2 is played, and then I go knight a6. This, believe it or not, is a flagrant mistake. The idea with knight a6 is that I just want to completely have insurance on the bond, stop that pawn in its tracks while I defend the c5 pawn, to then go d5, c4, d4. The problem with knight a6 is now white's plan of rook c1, rook b1, and then rook b6. White can't go directly rook b2 because my bishop is attacking that. So they would have to do this little detour. And once they're on b6, my knight's attacked, and I have to move it. I moved the knight to a6. That's 1 tempo, that's 1 time, that's 1 move. And then once my knight has to be kicked from a6, that's a 2nd move. So I lose 2 tempos from the past 2 moves if white goes through with this plan. Luckily, my opponent does not, but luckily should not be a word in your vocabulary in chess. So I go knight a6, my opponent goes with king f1. Bringing the king towards the center is pretty elementary, and so my opponent does it. Very, very nice, very common. I go with d5, and here basically my plan. The plan is to advance my 2 pawns as fast and as high as I possibly can, so that I tie up 2, 1, or 3 of these pieces, so that eventually I gather these pawns, so that these passed pawns end up making a queen or forced a material sacrifice from my opponent, so that bishop f4 was played. Then I go with c4 here, super nice. c4, putting my pawns on light squares is it's just a really good plan, because they're just nicely lined up with my bishop. My bishop controlling the next 2 squares of my pawn march is super nice, and will just help ease the pushing of my pawns. Pushing P's, bishop e3. So we see some hesitation from the white pieces. And now I go with rook e4. I have a slight advantage here. Rook b8 is apparently much, much better to try to maybe trade rooks so that my c pawn can fall. But rook e4 has a very distinct plan. I want to go with d4 here. It's not that good, and as you can see, I'm at 4 minutes left on my time control. Just rook d2? No, because I have d4 anyways. This is what I had seen. d4 here, f4 wins the bishop, bro. That was crazy. I saw this on my opponent's turn too, which is sick. I also have c3, which is really nice. And the rook is forced back, and then I would have d4, and that's also very nice. So the rook d2s don't really work in this position. And so my opponent played bishop b6, which is the best move. Just tying your bishop to the pawn while still staring at d4. But yeah, I can't push d4 here because rook takes c4. That is the premise of my opponent basically calling my bluff. But here I have a very nice move, c3. c3 has per objective to literally paralyze this rook as much as it can, as much as a pawn can in life. By taking up these two squares, the rook cannot move and play against my backwards d5 pawn. The rook cannot go on this open b file. And now I not only pave the way for my d pawn to go down the board because the rook can't take on c4 anymore, but my rook is now opened on the rank and can slide to a4, take a3, go to b3 if it has time, and go to b2, and then transpose into a very, very winning endgame with a pawn promotion in sight. So now my opponent goes g3, oblivious to my plan, and okay, I think this is a very good move. Rook a4, it just wins, but I'm seeing d4, it looks amazing. d4 threatening d3, which forces a piece of theirs to go back. Super good sign in the endgame. I thought of this sacrifice for maybe half my time here, which I think explains why I'll have 2 minutes less on the next turn. But after king takes d3, so taking off the knight, defending d3 square to play d3, rook a2 I saw, it's the only rook move that doesn't lose, rook e2, and then I saw c2 threatening c1 and discovery attack on the a1 square, so no rook a1. But then I saw king d2, bishop c3 check, you can't take because of queens, and then king c1, and I failed to see some very concrete way to win this. Instead here, I mimic my opponent and go for a very traditional king going into the center. A fun fact, the king is worth 4 points in the endgame when well positioned. So make sure to activate your king in the endgame when there are not enough pieces that the opponent has to mate your king in the center. So my opponent goes knight d3, just like my knight, just taking up the square before the pawn, and then I go king e7, escalate my king. I missed completely rook d2, that pins my rook and kind of forces a rook trade. Didn't know how I felt about that. I use this time to go king e6 and kind of call the bluff. If you take here, you just give me an extra super strong pawn and I win this super easily. Like knight c1, d3, and then d2, it's unstoppable. So then my opponent plays f3. And then I have a bad moment, let's just say. f3 here forces the rook trade. On rook here, I lose a pawn, right? Rook takes, pawn takes, and then bishop takes. So I don't love that. And rook here just seems like I'm going backwards in life. After rook takes, king takes, and my king is going against the grain on e7, it's not nice. So I'm forced to pretty much take. I also had rook e6 apparently. Wow, I didn't have time to look at that. But yeah, on rook takes, then I have f takes, and then this is completely over. That's nice. So I take here, thinking it's forced. King takes. And now I fail to see the most concrete winning plan ever. And I'm kind of attributing this to my time pressure. I have 2 minutes left on the clock. I'm not a saint here. But by all means, king d5, I was scared of this because of knight b4. And after knight takes, pawn takes, this pawn is walking down the board. But I missed that here I have c2 competing with this a pawn, and here the king would have to defend my pawn first. And now I have d3, bro. How is this winning? You'll see. D3, defending this pawn clutch. If king takes C1 queen, and if A6, it's way too late because I have bishop B2. You can't defend this ever. And if instead of going counterattack, you have bishop E3, then I have king C4 defending my pawn, and after A6, bishop B2, and now you can't take on E3 to defend C1 because of my king. And I'm just gonna promote this pawn. Let's say king moves out, bishop C3 check, king moves out, D2, if you take, I take. If A7, I can go C1 queen, U queen here, and then bishop E3, king here is forced, check this and mate. And actually it wasn't forced. If you go here, I have checkmate in 2 moves on F2. I did not see this. Instead here, I went with the very dubious king C6. Knight C1 is played. I just failed to see what is concrete here. I play king B5. The idea is maybe knight C5. The idea is maybe king C4 here I'm threatening. And after king D3, I'm like, oh my God, where has my advantage gone? And I have a minute 28. I'm clinging on to a draw right now. Like, it's crazy. So king D3, and then I go knight C5 check. Bishop takes is quite forced. Thank you for the assist. Wow, beautiful bird, by the way, green and in yellow. So on king C2, I was like, okay, I have so much space, I should win this. So it's pretty much forced. Bishop takes, king takes, and white can defend this pawn. It's like not that easy here. So after A4, you're kind of defending this with a wall of 2 pawns. And if I go king B4, then you have A6 and you're completely winning. I can't defend that A pawn. So my king is kind of contained here on C5. And so now I establish a plan. By the way, I have one winning move in this position, and it's F4. Breaking up the pawn structure to then fix the pawns with F5. The same exact theme that created these 2 doubled pawns. And then I would have bishop F6 to then attack the H4 pawn in the end. Instead, I go for the drawing bishop E5, attacking this. And my idea is to just surveil these pawns with my bishop and try to contain these pawns, like with my king. But the problem is this knight really gets to this pawn easily. So knight B3 check, king here, and the idea is that we would trade pawns. You take this one and I take this one. So that's exactly what happened. And now knight B3, and I've completely lost hope at this point. I don't have a win. I don't have a win. I was just, in this variation, I was planning on playing bishop B4 and settling for the draw, and I'm good. Even bishop B6, I'm giving this pawn. I have to play bishop B4 here. I'm about to play it. I have a minute on the clock. You just have to assume the draw at this point. But then, let me tell you about this. I see a move that brings me back to the days of when I was creative at the board, which was just last game, but you know, and I find this absolute masterpiece in this position. The black pieces have the insane, try to find it on your own, pause the video to solve the problem, black to play and win, C2. And this is not a brilliant move by chess.com. This is a brilliant move that I gave to myself because it saved my game. Opening up this bishop to then attack these already fixated pawns on the dark squares, created by a bishop E5 earlier to attack G3 that forced an F4 push and put all these pawns in vulnerable positions. You cannot take my bishop because I queen here on C1. So white has to take my pawn. And now I play bishop E1, and suddenly the white pieces are in big, big trouble because they find all their pieces on the queen side, whereas all their important pawns on the king side are about to be gobbled. My opponent goes A5, and I have time to take on G3, and then after A6, I go king C6. And here, after 3-4 minutes of thought, my opponent resigned. I was so surprised because my opponent has a resource here. Knight C5. If I take this knight, A7 wins on the spot. The threat is a7 with the c5 knight taking b7 wins on the spot. Here I have to see that, and I saw it, and play king b6. And now after knight d3 I had calculated, takes, I was really not sure of this endgame, because after takes, my king is way too far away. So like, let's say king here, I would have to take, king here, and I just really didn't like this, how my king gets shouldered out of the center in king e6. But luckily there's just h5 and like let the pawn go, and it's completely winning for black. But I was nervous going into this. My opponent resigned after king c6, and that's how we picked up our 3rd dub after 6 rounds.
Here are the 8 lessons learned from this game. Number 1 is establish a good second and reliable opening for lower rated players. This is to avoid them preparing against your main opening and then you being completely blindsided by what they play. And that's what I played in this game. After d4, knight f6, my opponent went for a London system type-esque, and I immediately called the bluff. Well, not the bluff, but I immediately called this with a second opening emerging, completely taking them out of their opening preparation. By the way, this was done against me multiple times during this tournament, in which I was the weaker player and I prepared against them, and then they completely smashed me with a new move. So it happens to me. I do it to people with lower ratings than me. This is how it works. Number 2, after this weird move, bishop c1, my opponent is undeveloping their piece. And that's where I would offer some advice for me and against my opponent. Always favor natural and beautiful piece development for yourself. So unlike my opponent who goes bishop c1, I literally show my opponent how it's done in the next moves that I play. So you want to develop your pieces to, okay, a square that's defended, that's very basic, but more so a tempo gaining square, so I'm attacking the queen, and then beyond that my bishop is a super strong piece. So that bishop f5 move is such a beautiful move for so many multiple reasons, and I'm just closer together to connect my rooks. So that much closer after knight d7, there you go, my rooks are connected, and this is another beautiful thing. My knight goes to a very natural square for the Benoni structures, can go to e5, but goes to b6, which is also natural for this position, and again, a tempo move on my opponent. This is a sequence that is textbook beautiful development in piece coordination, in piece optimization, just beautiful. Tip number 3, just very further along in this game, I was very, very patient until I looked beyond a tactic that didn't work. So look for tactics that don't work, in that here, knight g3 looks like an appealing move, because if you take my knight, your pawns are completely destroyed. It opens up the e-file for me. I take back a piece. I win this very nice dark square bishop that's now dominant, and I have the open e-file. Your pawn structure is destroyed. This is better for me, although it doesn't really do anything after rook to e1, in which here my knight looks quite funny. This bishop is defended. There's no apparent tactic, but look for tactics when there are none. In this position, it would seem that you're taking a bad bishop off the board because it's a bishop that's inside its own zone. It's behind its pawn structure. It's not an active bishop that's taking up full diagonals. It's nothing like that. But there's a second way to look at it. There's 2 sides to every coin, and this bishop, once looking a little bit deeper, is actually a strong piece for white because it defends a very big weakness of theirs, which is the c4 pawn. And after I trade that off the board and then going into tip number 5, skipping 4, fixate your pieces on your opponent's weakness, which is, in this case, the c4 pawn. I'm fixing my pieces directing my pieces toward this weakness on c4 to force them to defend, and then reverting back to tip number 4. Don't know why I formatted it this way, but then always break your opponent's pawn structure. Destroy your opponent's pawn structure. It's meant to be destroyed. And that is the key move I play here. a4 is such a beautiful move to really disconnect all these pawns, and after takes, which is pretty much forced. You have what we call a broken pawn structure, double isolated pawns here on the a file, a backward weak pawn that's very hard to defend on c4, and of course you take this pawn. It's a juicier pawn because by taking this pawn you get a protected pass pawn, whereas by taking these pawns you don't get any pass pawn whatsoever, and these pawns stay weak, whereas this pawn, if it's protected well enough, it can stay on the board. So take the temporary weakness first and the most needed pawn to be taken. Which brings us directly, as we're going into this game, into tip number 6, liquidate the position when you have an advantage. What does liquidate mean? Swipe the queens off the board when you have the advantage. And here I seek to gain a pawn, but it's much more than that. Here I have 2 passed pawns, whereas my opponent has 1 passed pawn, 2 passed pawns on 1 file, but they're isolated double pawns. It's way less strong than mine, and I'm just a pawn up. So this is textbook better endgame and easy to convert, although it wasn't easy to convert in the game, but that's another story. And I have a very easy winnable game, which brings me to tip number 7, directly back to back to back ting. Do the absolute minimum in terms of number of moves to defend your opponent's counterattack. So here I play like a preventative knight a6, but this is a really bad move. The second white finds the time to play rook c1, rook b1, rook b6 and attack my knight here, I would have to defend that knight, which just in terms gives a tempo to the white pieces for no reason, whereas my knight can stay on c7, take up the a6 square, not having me dispense a move to just take up a6. I'm already taking up a6, the knight is already doing the job, and then using that extra move to crucially push these pawns and try to convert the advantage. The idea here is that the more you take your time solely on pushing these pawns, the more these pieces eventually will get caught up in having to defend these pawns, and thus will reduce the number of chances that they have to counterattack on your weaknesses, which is the knight on a6 here. Make sense? And finally, I botched this endgame. Okay, I was down on time, but really no excuse. Play till the very end. This game demanded mental strength at the end of the day. It's a 61 move win, which it shouldn't have been, for a reason, because I failed to convert this way easier way prior to this. But all the same, I played until the very end. I think I should give myself credit here, finding this c2 brilliant move, sacking a pawn to get all these pawns here. Play till the very end, even if you lost an advantage. Always try to grind for that new good move. And my tip under that, which is still tip 8, is always be open to change your plan or move for a better one. So here, here I was supposed to play king b4, which is a total draw as well. This is still a total draw, but after bishop takes and then knight b3 mistake, I was supposed to play bishop b4, which just defends my pawn passively. Change your plan, look for another move, and here I have c2. And now if you take, I have queens, and this is kind of a discovered attack on a square, which is really, really cool. So always be ready to change your plan for a better one. Upgrade your plans.
Thank you so much for watching. I hope you had an amazing viewing experience of the Colosseum there, a little bit of, I don't even know the name of this thing. It's incredible. It's incredible. But yeah, especially the first part of this video of the Colosseum is mind-blowing. Thank you so much for watching, and see you next time.